Imagine for a moment, what if everything you were taught about the Bible was incomplete? What if the story we've been told about good and evil was only the tip of the iceberg? Deep in Africa, centuries before sacred books were compiled, there was knowledge so profound it challenged kings, empires, and even the gods of the official narrative. Across deserts, rivers, and mountains, ancestral wisdom held the secrets of life, death, energy, and consciousness, passed down through rituals, symbols, and oral traditions that survive to this day. Knowledge so powerful, it was deliberately altered and hidden to control humanity. But what was silenced never truly vanished. It hid in masks, chants, dance, and even within the human body. Every gesture, every rhythm, every word carries fragments of a forgotten truth, waiting to be rediscovered. And with every step we take toward understanding this wisdom, we realize that Africa's past still pulses within the present. This is the moment to open your eyes to what has been hidden for millennia. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment where in the world you're hearing this ancestral revelation. Get ready to uncover mysteries that challenge everything we thought we knew about history and human spirituality. Long before parchment hardened into doctrine and verses were nailed into stone, there was a whisper moving across the African continent like warm wind over sand. It carried a question people were never meant to ask out loud. Not what is evil, but who decided what evil was in the first place? Funny thing, questions like that tend to make empires uncomfortable. In the oldest temples along the Nile and deep within the highlands of ancient Kush, wisdom wasn't framed as a threat. Knowledge was breath, rhythm, alignment. Yet somehow, centuries later, that same knowing would be repackaged as danger. A fall, a stain, almost as if awakening had been inconvenient. Strange how that works. The story drifts through torchlit chambers, where priests memorized truths instead of writing them down. They knew ink could be burned, but memory traveled. They spoke of humans not as broken beings, but as unfinished ones, capable of remembering something vast. That idea didn't age well once power needed obedience more than clarity. As new scriptures crossed deserts and seas, something subtle happened. Certain questions vanished, certain meanings bent just enough to turn wisdom into warning. The shift was quiet, almost elegant. No thunder, no demons, just edits, omissions, and the gentle insistence that curiosity itself was risky. And so, the air thickened with silence. Not because answers were lost, but because asking became dangerous. Somewhere between Africa's oldest stories and the pages people swear are complete, a door was closed, yet the hinge still creaks, as if something on the other side never stopped knocking. Time moves, but it doesn't rush. It settles into valleys and riverbanks, especially in Africa, where geography itself became scripture. From the Nile's patient flow to the red earth of the Sahel, history unfolded long before borders had names. Civilizations rose with calendars, astronomy, medicine, and law, quietly sophisticated, inconveniently advanced. Funny how that part rarely makes the headlines. These societies didn't separate the spiritual from the practical. Temples doubled as universities, and rituals carried data encoded in rhythm, symbol, and movement. To outsiders, it looked mystical. To insiders, it was method. Knowledge passed through drums, stars, and breath, not exactly the kind of archive conquerors knew how to loot. As trade routes expanded and foreign powers leaned in, curiosity turned into extraction: gold, salt, labor, and ideas. But ideas are tricky. You can borrow them, but you can't always control what they do once they settle in. Some concepts spread faster than armies, especially the ones that remind people of their own authority. So narratives shifted. Africa became a backdrop instead of a source, a setting, not a storyteller. Its timelines were shortened, its philosophies labeled as folklore. Ironically, many of those same myths mirrored teachings that later appeared elsewhere, just with different names and stricter rules. And beneath the noise of conquest and translation, the land kept memory. Stones remembered footsteps. Rivers remembered prayers, because geography doesn't forget, even when books do, and the deeper the roots, the harder they are to erase, which raises the next question waiting just under the surface. In the beginning, there was no single face to this story, only a force subtle and unclaimed. Not a god demanding worship, not a king seeking loyalty, but a current of knowing that moved through initiates, midwives, astronomers, and healers. It didn't speak loudly. It didn't need to. Truth rarely does. This force taught that the human spirit wasn't borrowed from the divine, it was shaped from it. Identity wasn't something granted later through obedience, it was present at birth, waiting to be remembered. That idea, gentle as it sounds, carried a quiet rebellion. Systems built on hierarchy don't sit well with equality of essence. Across generations, this knowing took many forms. In some places, it was encoded in creation stories. In others, in symbols carved into stone or sung at dawn. The message stayed consistent even as the language changed. Humanity wasn't fallen. It was distracted. And distraction, as it turns out, is easier to manage than freedom. When new religious frameworks arrived, this presence didn't disappear. It was rebranded, fragmented, sometimes absorbed, sometimes condemned. What once guided became something to guard against. A curious transformation, how a mirror can suddenly be called a threat when people recognize themselves too clearly in it. Still, traces remained, in gestures, in rhythms, in instincts that survived translation. The force never demanded belief, only remembrance. And somewhere along that long road of forgetting, another symbol would take center stage. One that history would later learn to fear. It slithered into the story long before it was ever accused. In Africa's oldest cosmologies, this symbol moved between worlds with ease, shedding skin the way seasons shed time. It wasn't hunted, it wasn't cursed. It was watched, respected, sometimes even thanked. Wisdom, after all, rarely walks upright. Along temple walls and ceremonial objects, the form appeared again and again, coiled, endless, alive. It spoke of renewal, of cycles that don't beg permission to begin again. To those who understood, it marked the thin line between ignorance and insight. Step closer, and you didn't fall, you saw. But symbols travel, and meaning doesn't always survive the journey intact. As belief systems crossed borders, the image began to feel uncomfortable, too ancient, too powerful, too independent. Funny how something once associated with healing and balance suddenly became suspicious when it refused to kneel. The shift wasn't dramatic. No single moment, no official announcement, just a slow turn of the lens. What once offered knowledge was reframed as temptation. What once guided transformation was recast as threat. The irony, the symbol didn't change, only the story told about it did. And as fear replaced reverence, a deeper pattern emerged, one that repeated itself whenever African wisdom appeared elsewhere. Rename it, redefine it, remove its roots. Because if a symbol teaches people to awaken, someone, somewhere, will insist they stay asleep. And that's where the real tension begins. The knowledge didn't shout, it unsettled. It suggested that power wasn't granted from above, but cultivated within, through discipline, memory, and alignment with forces older than crowns. For emerging empires, that idea was inconvenient. Control works better when people believe they need permission to be whole. Across ancient Africa, initiation wasn't about submission. It was about responsibility. To know more meant to carry more. Symbols, numbers, and celestial movements were taught carefully because wisdom without maturity could unbalance a community. Funny enough, later systems would call this secrecy elitist, while practicing far stricter gatekeeping themselves. As foreign authorities encountered these teachings, admiration quietly mixed with anxiety. You can trace it in the translations, in the way certain passages soften or harden depending on who's holding the pen. The message slowly bends. Humans are no longer rising toward the divine, they're falling away from it. A subtle flip, with massive consequences. Over time, liberation began to look like heresy. Self-knowledge felt dangerous. Any path that didn't require intermediaries was suddenly framed as chaos. Ironically, the very wisdom accused of threatening order had sustained entire civilizations in balance for centuries. So the threat wasn't demons or dark rituals, it was autonomy of spirit. And once that became clear, suppression followed a familiar pattern. Because when an idea teaches people they're more than subjects, someone will always rewrite the story, which leads straight into the next quiet transformation waiting to be uncovered. When the text began to travel farther than the people who birthed their ideas, something fragile happened. Stories were lifted from their soil and carried into rooms where context didn't survive the journey. Names changed, meanings narrowed. What was once fluid became fixed. What was once sung became law. In those transitions, omissions spoke louder than additions. Certain rituals vanished between lines. Certain symbols were stripped of their layered meanings and left with a single, safer interpretation. Irony crept in quietly. What had been shared freely for harmony was now guarded to preserve authority. Fragments of older African cosmologies can still be felt beneath the surface of later scriptures. The rhythm is there, faint but persistent. Creation through vibration, breath as life force, order emerging from sound. These ideas didn't disappear. They were absorbed, then disciplined into something more controllable. Archaeology hints at this borrowing without naming it outright. Temples older than the texts that echo them. Symbols predating the doctrines that later claim them. It's not accusation, it's pattern. History leaves fingerprints even when it tries to wear gloves. And the deeper scholars dig, the more these echoes align across cultures that were never supposed to meet. Which raises an uncomfortable thought. If the roots are shared, why was one origin honored while another was erased? That question lingers, patiently waiting for the next layer to be peeled back. Silence didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, wrapped in translation and authority. What couldn't be fully controlled was labeled dangerous, and what couldn't be erased was reframed. Africa's spiritual systems weren't destroyed overnight. They were renamed, reduced, and politely dismissed as superstition, a softer violence but effective. As doctrines hardened, fear became a tool. Not loud fear, subtle fear. Fear of asking too much. Fear of stepping outside prescribed belief. Where ancestral systems encouraged dialogue with the unseen, new structures demanded obedience to it. One invites responsibility, the other prefers submission. Guess which one scales better? Communities that once held ceremonies under open skies were pushed inward, their practices driven underground. Drums quieted, symbols were hidden in plain sight. Survival required adaptation. So the wisdom learned to wear masks, disguising itself as folklore, rhythm, or story told only at night. Colonial expansion later amplified what theology had already rehearsed. Spiritual conquest preceded physical domination. Convince a people their past is cursed, and they'll abandon it themselves. The irony is sharp. The same powers that condemned African rites quietly absorbed their symbolism elsewhere. Yet, suppression has a side effect. It preserves what it tries to kill. What is hidden often survives longer than what is celebrated. And beneath the layers of denial and distortion, something ancient kept breathing, waiting for the moment it could be recognized again when the ground was ready. Long after the silence settled, traces began to surface where no one expected them. In symbols etched into stone thousands of miles apart. in myths that shared the same bones but wore different skins. Africa's spiritual fingerprints showed up in places that officially denied knowing her. Coincidence, they said. History loves that word when it's cornered. Flood stories echoed across continents. Civilizing figures descended from the heavens, carrying law, agriculture, and sacred knowledge. Serpents, stars, and sacred mountains reappeared again and again. The irony was almost poetic. Traditions dismissed as primitive somehow carried the same architecture as the so-called foundations of civilization. In the Americas, in Mesopotamia, in Asia, initiatory patterns mirrored African rites: death, rebirth, remembrance. Different names, same journey. Scholars tiptoe around this, careful with language, cautious with conclusions. Because once connections are acknowledged, hierarchies start to wobble. These parallels weren't accidents of imagination. Trade routes existed long before textbooks admit. Oceans weren't barriers, they were highways. Knowledge moved with people. And Africa stood at the crossroads far more often than history is comfortable admitting. Funny how isolated cultures keep telling the same stories. The more these echoes align, the harder it becomes to claim a single, exclusive origin for sacred truth. And that realization carries weight. Because if wisdom was shared, then its suppression was deliberate. And deliberate acts always leave trails, leading deeper into a story that refuses to stay buried. As centuries turned, fragments of the old knowledge found new hiding places, in chants disguised as hymns, in symbols softened into decoration, in numbers treated as coincidence rather than code. What survived did so quietly, slipping through the cracks of official narratives like light under a closed door. In the African diaspora, memory adapted again. Torn from land, language, and names, the spirit didn't vanish, it translated. Drums spoke where words were forbidden. Movement carried what books could not. Rituals reshaped themselves to fit hostile ground, holding on to essence even when form had to change. Ironically, many who condemned these practices sensed their power instinctively. That's why they were feared. Anything capable of restoring identity threatens systems built on erasure. Control works best when people forget who they were before being told who to be. Modern psychology, neuroscience, and physics now circle ideas ancient Africa lived by. Vibration, interconnectedness, consciousness shaping reality. The language is new, the laboratories sterile, but the insight feels familiar. Almost like rediscovery pretending to be innovation. And so the question drifts forward into the present. If the past keeps resurfacing in new disguises, maybe it was never lost, only waiting. Waiting for a time when listening becomes safer than silence, and when the next layer of this forgotten truth is finally ready to speak. Today, the echoes feel louder, not because they've grown stronger, but because more people are finally listening. Old assumptions crack under new questions. Why do symbols once condemned now resurface as wellness, mindfulness, or ancient wisdom? Funny how a truth becomes acceptable once it's stripped of its origin. Museums quietly relabel artifacts. Universities revise timelines. DNA studies whisper what oral traditions have always known. Africa wasn't peripheral, it was central. The resistance to this idea isn't academic, it's psychological. Accepting it requires rethinking who taught whom, and that's never comfortable. Faith too begins to shift. Some believers feel the tension but can't quite name it. The stories still move them, yet something feels incomplete, like a melody missing its opening note. The discomfort isn't disbelief, it's recognition brushing against memory. In politics and culture, identity becomes a battlefield. Who owns history? Who defines truth? These questions echo ancient conflicts dressed in modern language, because controlling the past has always been a shortcut to controlling the future. And beneath all of this, a deeper awareness stirs. Not loud, Not organized, just persistent. A sense that something essential was never meant to disappear. And once that sense awakens, it doesn't ask permission. It simply begins searching, pulling the story toward its final unveiling. There's a reason this awakening doesn't arrive with trumpets or commandments. It comes as curiosity, as that quiet moment when a familiar story suddenly feels incomplete, when certainty loosens its grip and irony slips in because what was once dismissed now starts making a little too much sense. Ancient African wisdom never demanded conversion. It invited alignment. You didn't submit to truth, you tuned yourself to it. That's a sharp contrast to systems built on enforcement. And maybe that's why this knowledge was never truly defeated, only paused, waiting for minds ready to hold it without fear. Across the world, people begin retracing steps without realizing who walked them first. Meditation mirrors initiation. Energy work echoes old rites. The language changes, the essence doesn't. Funny how the new age keeps rediscovering the oldest pages of the human story. This return isn't about replacing belief with belief. It's about restoring balance between spirit and matter, memory and progress. Africa's legacy doesn't ask for worship. It asks for acknowledgement, a subtle but radical difference. And as this awareness spreads, another question rises with it. One history still avoids answering directly. If so much was hidden to control humanity, what else is still sealed, waiting beneath the surface for those willing to look without flinching? The sealed things were never buried in one place. They were scattered, intentionally. Some in desert ruins, others in language itself. Certain words lost their original pulse, trimmed down until they fit neatly into doctrine. Meaning wasn't destroyed, it was domesticated. Much easier to manage that way. In ancient Africa, words carried vibration, not just definition. To speak was to activate. Names aligned people with forces larger than identity. Strip that away, and language becomes instruction instead of invocation. Funny how power fades when words stop resonating and start commanding. Traces of this older speech still surface in chants, tonal languages, and sacred sounds that don't translate cleanly. Scholars call it phonetics. Initiates knew it as something else entirely, sound as bridge. Sound as key. Once you hear it, silence never feels the same again. Later, religious structures sensed this instinctively. That's why certain languages were declared holy, while others were dismissed as noise. Control the tongue, and you shape the thought. Control the thought and belief follows. It's subtle, elegant, almost admirable if it weren't so effective. Yet the body remembers what language forgets. Rhythm resurfaces in breath, in music, in ritual movement. Even now, something ancient stirs when sound hits just right. And that stirring hints at another hidden layer, one encoded not in texts, but in the human form itself. The body was never meant to be separate from the sacred. In Africa's oldest systems, it was the first temple, mapped with stars, directions, and energies long before anatomy had names. Posture, movement, breath, all carried meaning. Nothing was random, everything aligned. Later traditions would spiritualize the soul and distrust the flesh, as if one could exist without the other. An odd contradiction, considering how many revelations arrive through sensation. The irony is hard to miss. A body declared weak, yet constantly monitored, disciplined, and controlled. Initiatory practices once used the body as a gateway. Fasting altered perception. Dance opened trance. Scarification marked thresholds of becoming. These weren't acts of pain for pain's sake, but technologies of awareness. Remove the context, and they look barbaric. Remove the practices, and something vital goes quiet. Modern science circles these truths cautiously, talking about memory in cells, trauma in tissue, intelligence beyond the brain. New words, old ideas. Africa understood the body as Archive, storing history where no book could reach. That's why erasing knowledge required reshaping how people related to their own flesh. Even now, reactions happen before thoughts. Goosebumps during chants, tears without story. The body responds to something it recognizes but can't explain, and that recognition suggests the final hiding place of ancient wisdom was never a text at all, but the living human itself. If the human being became the last archive, then forgetting had to feel natural. Disconnection was framed as progress. Intuition was softened into instinct, then quietly dismissed. What couldn't be measured was labeled unreliable, even though entire civilizations once depended on it with precision. Ancient African systems trained perception the way others trained soldiers. Dreams were studied, visions were contextualized. Silence itself was a teacher. Knowledge wasn't downloaded, it unfolded. And that pace mattered, because rushing revelation without grounding can fracture both mind and community. As time moved on, these practices were caricatured or stripped of depth. Vision became superstition. Ancestral communication became taboo. The irony lingers. The same societies that rejected these ways later chased altered states through chemistry, technology, and endless distraction. Yet perception has a way of resurfacing when conditions allow it. People sense patterns before they can explain them. They feel when something is off, even if logic says otherwise. That sensitivity isn't new, it's ancient, and it's been waiting patiently beneath layers of conditioning. Which leads to a quiet realization. If awareness can be trained, it can also be untrained. And if it was deliberately dulled once, it can be sharpened again. The question isn't whether the knowledge still exists, but who remembers how to listen when it starts speaking back. Remembering doesn't arrive as revelation, it arrives as resonance. A feeling that lands before explanation. In ancient Africa, this was understood. Memory wasn't linear, it was cyclical. What was known would return when conditions aligned. No panic, no urgency, just timing. That's why so much wisdom was encoded symbolically instead of spelled out. Masks weren't costumes, they were interfaces. Geometry wasn't decoration, it was instruction. To the unprepared eye, it looked like art. To the initiated, it was a map. Ironically, the symbols survived precisely because they were misunderstood. As global systems standardized belief, symbolism became suspicious. Ambiguity was dangerous. Better to define everything clearly, even if clarity flattened meaning. Mystery was replaced with answers, and questions were quietly discouraged. After all, certainty is easier to govern than curiosity, yet symbols don't expire. They wait. They reappear in dreams, logos, architecture, and digital culture, often stripped of origin, but still charged. People feel drawn without knowing why. That pull isn't nostalgia, it's recognition without language. And as more symbols resurface in unexpected places, another layer of the story begins to unfold. Because when meaning returns without permission, it challenges not just history, but the structures that insisted it was gone. And that tension sets the stage for what comes next. Even when entire civilizations were dismissed as footnotes, their influence never truly vanished. Rivers carried names older than empires. Mountains remembered ceremonies no longer spoken aloud. The land itself became a quiet custodian, holding what human authorities tried to erase. Oral traditions, too, persisted in shadows. Songs, chants, and folktales kept knowledge alive, encoded in rhythm and repetition. Outsiders labeled it myth, failing to notice that myths can store more truth than textbooks ever dare. There's a certain irony in how what's considered fiction can outlast enforced fact. Across the diaspora, displaced peoples clung to fragments, rituals, names, foods, dances. Each act was survival disguised as culture, each remembrance a silent rebellion. knowledge adapted, shifting into forms that could endure without provoking persecution. The essence survived, even if the labels changed. Even now, the reverberations are subtle but unmistakable. Spiritual practices, music, language, and social systems echo these roots. Recognition doesn't require study. It requires attention. The connections are there for those willing to notice, bridging past and present in ways history tried to prevent. And somewhere beneath all of this lies the reminder: erasure is never complete. The seeds planted centuries ago still grow quietly in the human mind, waiting for the right moment to bloom again, pointing toward truths that authorities thought had been buried forever. By now, the hidden currents are more than whispers. They are threads weaving through culture, memory, and spirit. Africa's legacy pulses beneath the surface of continents, manifesting in ways that textbooks often ignore. The irony is sharp. The very people who claim dominion over history cannot stop it from surfacing. Artifacts, once catalogued as curiosities, begin to speak when seen with the right lens. Masks, sculptures, and ceremonial objects reveal patterns that align with celestial events, human biology, and philosophical frameworks. Science and spirituality converge quietly, proving what was long suspected. The ancients knew far more than we give them credit for. Even modern consciousness carries traces. Dreams, intuition, synchronicities. People sense what cannot yet be explained. It's subtle, almost imperceptible, but persistent. A rhythm, a vibration, a reminder of what was never truly lost, just concealed behind layers of distortion. Colonial, religious, and political systems attempted to contain the human spirit through control of knowledge. Yet nature, memory, and lineage proved more resilient than any decree. Information disguised as ritual, movement, or song survived because it was alive, not written. And now, as the world slowly reconnects with these ancient streams, another question emerges. If what was hidden can be found again, how much more remains buried, waiting for those willing to perceive it without fear? Time itself seems to bend around what was hidden. Centuries of erasure, distortion, and exile could not fully sever the connection between people and their ancestral knowing. It lingers in gestures, in the cadence of speech, in the rhythm of life itself, a pulse older than empires. This pulse resurfaces in unexpected places. Festivals, art, music, even in the quiet intuition of those who have never set foot on African soil. It is subtle, but insistent, a reminder that suppression never destroys essence, it only delays recognition. Irony thrives here. What was labeled dangerous becomes a lifeline generations later. Scholarship and science are beginning to trace these threads, cautiously mapping what oral traditions preserved for millennia. From pyramids to mud brick temples, from chants to cosmic calendars, the evidence accumulates quietly, a testament to resilience. Yet the deeper truths remain encoded, awaiting those who can see beyond translation. Every rediscovery feels like a door creaking open. Symbols, rituals, and stories long dismissed now hint at profound understanding. Humans as co-creators, the body as archive, the spirit as navigator. Knowledge is awakening, step by careful step. And as this current flows into the present, it leaves a tantalizing thought suspended. If so much has returned, despite attempts to erase it, what other secrets lie just beneath the surface, ready to re-emerge when humanity finally listens? The story now bends toward the present, where echoes of the past pulse quietly beneath everyday life. Ancient African wisdom, once hidden or ridiculed, appears in modern rituals, music, meditation, and philosophy. It is subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniable for those who pay attention. People feel it in instinct, intuition, and emotional resonance, responses that defy rational explanation but carry centuries of memory. The irony is thick. Systems that once suppressed this knowledge now marvel at it under new names, calling it innovation or self-help. The truth, however, has simply returned to itself. Artifacts, texts, and oral histories converge in unexpected alignments. Across continents, in forgotten temples and diaspora communities, patterns emerge that point to shared origins, interconnected knowledge, and cosmic awareness. The threads of memory refuse to be severed, and so history itself seems to bend backward, revealing that what was labeled dangerous was never evil, it was empowerment. And those willing to listen, feel, and remember are the ones who reclaim it. Yet the final layer remains just out of reach. Another secret waits in the shadows, beneath the sands, beneath the silence, and it asks the same question Africa has always whispered. If so much can survive attempts to erase it, what else is waiting to awaken next? Time folds again, and the past begins to speak in rhythms we've almost forgotten. Africa's ancestral knowledge is no longer confined to temples or oral tradition. It hums through culture, music, and memory, calling out to those willing to listen. Its presence is subtle but relentless, like wind over sand-shaping dunes unseen. Even in the smallest gestures, dance, song, communal gathering, traces of forgotten wisdom resurface. People sense patterns before they understand them, as if their bodies remember stories that history tried to erase. Irony lingers. What was once forbidden now flows freely in ways no authority can fully control. Across continents and oceans, fragments align. A rhythm here, a symbol there. Echoes of ancient African civilizations resurface in ways modern science and spirituality are only beginning to decode. The past and present converse quietly, reminding us that erasure was never complete. And in this unfolding, one truth becomes clear: the so-called hidden knowledge was never gone. It survived because it is alive, adaptive, and embedded in the human experience itself, waiting for the moment it could be remembered consciously. Which raises the next whisper, the next thread of the story. If so much has returned despite centuries of suppression, what other layers of truth are still sleeping, waiting for those brave enough to awaken them? The final currents of this story ripple through the modern world, almost unnoticed, yet undeniably present. Ancient African wisdom persists in rituals, music, and intuition, quietly shaping thought, culture, and belief. Its subtlety is its strength. It cannot be fully controlled, only felt. Even where written histories have been altered, the echoes remain in gestures, rhythms, and patterns of life. The human body remembers what books try to erase. Breath, movement, and song carry knowledge older than any empire, whispering truths to those willing to perceive them. Ironically, the same systems that once sought to suppress this wisdom now draw from it. Through meditation, holistic practices, and cultural appreciation, without acknowledging the origins. Recognition comes slowly, often under the guise of novelty. Yet the essence remains intact. The story continues in every act of remembrance, in every ritual, in every rediscovery. Africa's legacy is not confined to the past. It lives, pulses, and waits for those who seek understanding beyond textbooks and dogma. And so the question lingers, as it always has. If centuries of suppression could not erase this knowledge, what other secrets lie beneath the surface, patiently waiting for humanity to awaken and remember once more? As the echoes of Africa's hidden wisdom settle into the present, we begin to understand that history was never truly silent. It was waiting, patient and resilient beneath sands, stones, and rivers. Every symbol, chant, and ritual that survived whispers of truths too profound to be erased. This legacy reminds us that knowledge is living. It flows through generations, connecting spirit, body, and mind in ways that textbooks and empires could never contain. What was once hidden teaches us that the past is not gone. It lives in us, shaping how we perceive the world, ourselves, and the sacred threads that bind us all. Even now, mysteries sleep beneath the earth, in temples forgotten, in artifacts dusted over by time, in stories only half remembered. The African continent, cradle of civilization and keeper of secrets, still guards lessons waiting to awaken. And each discovery is a step closer to remembering who we are. So let this be a call. Honor the wisdom that persists. Seek the knowledge that refuses to vanish, and recognize that the story is far from over. Subscribe, activate notifications, and continue walking this path of ancestral revelation with us, because the journey has only just begun.